The next place we're going to cover is going to be here over in the basic panel. And if I say that the basic panel is probably, 85–90% of the work you'll do inside of Camera Raw, the next 6 sliders that we're going to talk about are probably 85–90% of the basic panel, everything that you're going to do inside of the basic panel. Okay, so these 6 sliders, extremely powerful, and I think what you're going to find is that, I can't just do a video on exposure. That's why I called this exposure and toning, because we're going to cover all these together, because I think what you'll find is you'll use them all together. Very rarely will you just move one, everything will be good. And most of the time, you'll move one, move a couple others, and then you'll come back and you'll move the same one again. So it just kind of happens a lot. We'll talk about 2 different types of photos too. We've got a landscape and we've got a portrait. Okay, exposure. Okay, the first thing I'll do, let's say I usually go to white balance. I'm going to warm this one up a little bit. Come down here to exposure. This is like the heavy hitter. This is the sledgehammer, okay? It's the overall exposure. I want the whole photo brighter. I want the whole photo darker. In this one, it's hard to say because if I go brighter, I like the detail I'm getting in the trees in the foreground. It's making the sky too bright, okay? If I go darker, well, I kind of like the sky better, but the foreground's almost silhouetted. So you got to be careful here. All right, so I'll kind of leave it set here. Don't forget you can always turn on your shadow, your highlight and shadow clipping warnings, these little triangles up here. If you turn those on as you go to the right or you go to the left, you'll start to see those clippings. And you'll start to see if it turns red, it means it's actually turning white in the photo. If you see it turn blue, it means it's turning all black. Okay? So if I go too high here, the next one, we're going to skip contrast for now because I usually use that last. But let's say, I would never say this is the exposure for the photo. Let's say I did. Highlights down here, let's let you bring back your highlights. All right, I can tone down those highlights. I can do it with exposure, but if I just wanted to bring back the highlights in that one area, I can reel them back in here by moving my highlights. Now, something more down to earth is if you look at the bright areas of the photo, like the sky, it lets me darken the sky or brighten the sky. Okay? The highlights are working on specifically just the highlights. And that's why I like in Camera Raw 7, if you used recovery before this, I like highlights much, much better. I feel like I get much more control with it. Okay, so I'll come in here and I'll tone down the highlights a little bit. Shadow's the exact opposite, opens up the shadowy areas. Typically move it to the right. Very rarely do I move this to the left to darken the shadow areas, and very rarely do I move the highlights to the right to brighten them. So I want to open up my shadowy areas. At that point, a lot of times I'll come back to exposure and I'll look at the overall exposure and say maybe I want to make it a little bit brighter by about a half a stop or so. And then I'll come down here to whites and blacks. This is really for people that just like to set a white and black point in Photoshop. Okay, it's not an absolute necessity, but I will show you how to use it, which is the best way to get a feel for your white and black point is to hold down the Option key on Mac or Alt on PC and drag your white slider to the right. Everything turns black, and whatever you start to see means it's turning white, means you got a white point. Same thing with blacks, but it's the opposite. Drag it to the left, and whatever you start to see means it's turning black, means you have a black point. Okay? And then when you see that white and black point, there's nothing saying you can't go back here and just kind of reel it back a little bit. But I'm okay with a couple of these little areas in the trees here to fall to black. They'd be in the shadows. I'm okay with that. All right, don't forget, you got a preview button up here. Turn the preview off. That's before, after. So it's showing you before any of these changes. Turn it on again, and it shows you the after image. So pretty significant change, right? For just moving, what, 5 sliders? That's a pretty big change. Okay, come over here to contrast. It's exactly what it says. It just adds contrast to the photo. You can see that's too far, obviously. It just adds a little bit more punch, a little bit more color saturation, and kind of darkens the blacks and brightens the whites. It's a lot, to me, I find I use contrast a lot less because I'll go in here and I'll set, when I go in and set the white and black point, that's a lot of times that's what contrast will do for you. Okay? All right, so let's jump over here to the portrait. Again, let's tweak our white balance. I'm going to just kind of overall warm the photo. Now this one, I know right off of the bat, I want to darken this photo. Exposure-wise, I think it's overexposed. So I'll bring it down by about, what, 3/4 of a stop or so? Okay. Come down here to highlights. That's going to be the highlights in their hair. See that bright sun behind their hair, that little rim light it gives? So I can tone that down a little bit. Shadows. Open up shadows. Not many shadows in this photo, so we won't have too much to do with the shadows. Whites and blacks, Option or Alt click, move to the right. I got my white point, move to the left, and I start to get my black point. Okay, let's turn our clipping warnings off too, because we don't need those anymore. But let's take a look at our preview here. Before, after. Again, really, really big change for pretty much just 5 sliders over here. Once again, before, after. Okay, and that was just 5 sliders. I haven't even gotten here to contrast yet. I can maybe punch the contrast just a tiny, tiny bit, but I don't want to make it any more contrasty than it already is. So I think what you'll find is that, first off, you'll like the sliders inside of Photoshop CS6 much better. If you're brand new, trust me, they're better than they were in CS5. If you came from CS5, might take a little getting used to. Give it a couple weeks. I think you're going to be much happier. You get so much more control with these highlights and shadows and exposure and whites and blacks the way that they work now inside of CS6. And when it comes to workflow, don't get too caught up with it. You know, white balance, exposure, highlights, shadows. And if sometimes you go in there and sometimes you do highlights and shadows first and you double back and you do exposure after the fact, it's totally fine. It's really kind of about what's going to look best on the photo. And sometimes you don't know whether you want to brighten or darken the entire photo until maybe you tweak the shadows and highlights, or maybe you tweak the exposure or the temperature or tint a little bit. And sometimes after you do that, then you realize that you want to do something else to it.